the easternmost state, where dawn first breaks on the United States, over land rising from the sea. It's here where America really began. Long before the Pilgrims, European explorers charted these waters. A land shared by sailors, poets, painters, and presidents, home to a grand master of the macabre and fields of fire. Where down east means heading north, and the North Woods cover 3.5 million acres. Aerial Maine is a journey across distant isles, down rugged shores, and into the great wilderness seafarers once called the mainland, Maine. One of Maine's southernmost towns is also one of its oldest. York lies on the York River. It includes the villages of York Harbor and York Beach. In fact, there are so many villages called York here, locals refer to them simply as the Yorks. In the early 1600s, the area was known as Agamenticus, the Native American Wabanaki word for the York River. York was founded by a wealthy Englishman with the unlikely name of Sir Ferdinando Gorges. He'd been awarded a land grant and permission to start a new colony in Maine. For 40 years, Gorges financed and masterminded expedition after expedition from England, spending his fortune to realize his dream of colonizing Maine. Gorges never actually set foot here and died a destitute man, but many consider him to be the father of the state. York claims to be the oldest settlement in Maine, and despite many early attacks on the village by Native Americans, the village survived. Amazingly today, many buildings from colonial days still stand. One of the most cherished is Sayward Wheeler House, a proud clapboard building from 1718. Jonathan Sayward was a wealthy shipping merchant, and many of his descendants lived and died here, right up to the 20th century. But Maine really begins here, offshore. The Isles of Shoals lie on its southernmost border. Maine is the only state to have just one state as a neighbor. And here, a simple causeway is all that divides Star Island, New Hampshire, from Smutty Nose Island, Maine. Appledore Island, on the Maine side, used to be a haunt of artists and free spirits, thanks to a welcoming poet and hotel keeper named Celia Thaxter. Her hotel burned down in the early 1900s, and the island's heyday seemed to be over. But this tower is evidence of the island's revival as a scientific research station. Despite the many islands and rocky dangers of the Maine coast, it was more than 250 years after the colonists arrived that the first lighthouse was built. Clapboard houses were built easily from the abundant trees, but the Cape Nettic Light was constructed of brick and clad in cast iron to weather the worst winters of the North Atlantic. Although modernized now, its original 3,000-pound fog bell and red light have guided seafarers since 1879. Locals know it as the Nubble Light, named for the lump of rock it's perched on. Many might be surprised to learn that the Cape Nettic Light, the Great Wall of China, and India's Taj Mahal have something in common. The Voyager spacecraft carried images of all three into space as examples of some of the Earth's most impressive man-made structures. On a brilliant fall day, Mainers and vacationers alike are drawn to its coast, and with good reason. A short walk along the cliffs leads to an unusual sighting in this rocky state. Miles and miles of sandy beach. The beach is actually a long sandbar split off from the mainland by the Ogunquit River. The Halloween storm of 1991, better known as the Perfect Storm, damaged much of the beach, but efforts are underway to protect its dunes and wildlife. But it's still Maine's rugged, natural beauty that draws most visitors today. And it's taken the work of extraordinary people to protect it. "11,000 years ago, Native Americans thrived in this region, using the coastal rivers for fresh water, transport, and an abundant source of food. While their original settlements have long gone, their ancient land remains. Today, part of it is called the Rachel Carson Wildlife Refuge, after one of the 20th century's greatest environmentalists and writers. Carson's groundbreaking book, Silent Spring, brought environmental concerns to an unprecedented portion of the American public and led to change in the country's use of pesticides. Today, the marshes and estuaries of the reserve are not only a refuge for wildlife, but humans too. Further north along the coast, the gold chain of beaches end, and normal ruggedness begins, just before we reach the main town that's best known around the world, Kennebunkport. Here, strewn across the city's center, are the 18th and 19th century homes of the country's early elite, who made their fortunes from the wealth of the oceans. One of the most unique homes in town is known as the Wedding Cake House. In 1825, a prominent shipbuilder named George Washington Bourne bought a Federal-style brick house for his new bride. But inspired by the design of a Gothic cathedral in Milan, he later restyled the house himself using only hand tools, completing the work just before his death in 1856. Today, it's one of the most photographed buildings in Maine. Kennebunk Beach is still a modest community, but it was here on Cape Arundel in 1903 that the wealthy Walker family chose to build their beachfront mansion. That's the W in the names of the two Bush presidents. Their seaside estate is known as Walker's Point. World leaders have passed the guard post here, welcomed by two Bush presidents. Margaret Thatcher, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Vladimir Putin have all signed the guest book. While the Maine coastline is a good place for politicians to unwind, it's even better for artists. At Prout's Neck, among the modern vacation homes of the wealthy, is the former studio of one of America's greatest landscape painters. Winslow Homer. Here, just a few feet from the ocean, he painted his monumental seascapes, images of the timeless struggle of men and women against the power of the sea. The turbulent seas he famously depicted are deceptively calm on this day. But the boatmen he captured wrestling with the elements were Mainers. 10 miles out, an island rises like a whale's hump out of the sea. It's thought the state took its name from the settlers on the more than 400 offshore islands along the coast who looked back to the mainland. Here on Monhegan Island, those views inspired painters Jamie Wyeth and Edward Hopper, who were attracted by its rugged beauty and remote location. Barely 1 square mile in area, Monhegan is accessible only by boat, and there are no paved roads. The year-round population is tiny, just 65. Today, the island's economy is still ruled, as it has been for centuries, by those who make their living from the sea, the courageous fishermen and lobstermen who work these waters through the harsh Maine winter. While the scenery is spectacular, the waters around Monhegan are treacherous. Countless ships have gone down here, some of them still visible. Approaching Portland, a great beacon calls out to homebound sailors, just as it has for centuries. Even today, the rocky shores of Portland are not easily navigated. But after a number of tragic shipwrecks, Maine's first lighthouse, the Portland Headlight, was built at the order of George Washington. Today, the old tower still stands, but much has changed since 16 whale oil lamps lit the lighthouse in 1791. Now an airport-style electric beacon rises 100 feet above the water. The light is visible from 16 miles away, welcoming mariners to safe harbor in Maine's biggest town. Situated in Casco Bay, Portland was once considered strategically important by the U.S. military because of its proximity to Europe compared to other eastern ports. The granite-walled Fort Scammell on House Island and Fort Gorges on Hog Island Ledge were originally built in the bay in the 1800s to protect against enemy attack. Mounds of sand were used to insulate the forts and their supplies of ammunition. But Fort Scammell was the only one to fire a shot in battle against a British privateer in 1813. In a state with only 1.3 million people, Portland's 64,000 citizens make it a metropolis. In the 19th century, when trade in Portland was booming, some of the state's oldest banks opened their doors here. And if you know who penned the lines, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere," take note that the childhood home of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is tucked in between modern office buildings. Many of Portland's other former residents ended up with some of the prettiest plots in town. 65,000 people are buried in Evergreen Cemetery, one of the largest publicly owned spaces in the city. And while many famous Mainers have been buried here, the story of one, the 19th century mayor Neil Dow, is infamous. Known as the father of the Prohibition, he managed to ban alcohol from the state, and in 1880 made a run at the White House on a prohibition ticket. He received just 10,000 votes. But prohibition was unpopular with much of Portland's working class. After all, Portland was a rum producer, and the city's workers were even allowed rum breaks during the day. There were riots in Portland when the mayor got his way, but chances are a few of the people who are buried here beside him succumbed to his demon rum. At its heart, the city that thrived on fishing and shipping in the 1800s is still a harbor town. Set on a peninsula reaching into Casco Bay, Portland remains, as Longfellow described it, the city by the sea. Today, the harbor that drew English settlers in 1632 still bustles with vessels big and small. But Maine is far more than just a seacoast. The state's landmass takes up half of New England, most of it remote and unspoiled. Among the pines of Maine's endless forests, one is struck by its majesty. One explorer of the region was the great 19th century thinker Henry David Thoreau. Of his visit here, he wrote, "I looked with awe at the ground I trod on. This was the earth of which we have heard, made out of chaos and old night." Words that led to his landmark book, The Maine Woods. Here at Moosehead Lake, Maine's largest, Thoreau writes of hiring a Penobscot Indian guide to help him cross the lake in a birch bark canoe, or what Thoreau described as a little eggshell of a boat. The lake stretches as far as the eye can see until it disappears into a great dark green forest. These are the 3.5 million acres of Maine's famous North Woods. Under a canopy of maples, firs, and white pine, black bears and moose cross the ancient lands of the Wabanaki. Today, 95% of Maine's forests are privately owned. In the 1990s, a group of high-profile conservationists lobbied to preserve 3 million acres of the North Woods as a national park, but the effort has stalled. With more than 90% of the state covered with trees and 39 commercial tree species, Maine's forest products industry contributes over $4 billion to the state's economy. Many of the state's hills and mountains are too low to break clear of the tree line, but not this one. At over 5,000 feet, Mount Katahdin's peaks are the highest in Maine. Its name comes from the Penobscot Indians and means the greatest mountain. Thanks to being the centerpiece of Baxter State Park, we can see the mountain much as it was when Thoreau scaled it in 1846. Mount Katahdin is also the northern end of the Appalachian Trail, a national scenic path that follows the spine of the Appalachian Mountains all the way to Georgia. Alongside Maine's carpet of forests, another dramatic landscape appears: the blueberry fields. Maine is the largest producer of wild blueberries in the world. Its fields cover 60,000 acres of land. By autumn, The blueberries have already been plucked from the bushes, and the leaves turn a vivid shade of red, the color of flame. In the distance, great clouds of smoke reveal a real fire. In a technique first used by Native Americans, the bushes are cut back every 2 years and then burned in order to stimulate new growth. The fire and smoke increase berry yields and kill insects and diseases in a traditional, organic way. Inland Maine is a land tied to the great rivers that make their way to the sea, and the Kennebec is no exception. Follow the Kennebec River south from its source at Moosehead Lake, and you'll find a bustling waterway, bordered with towns and cities, stretching all the way to Merrymeeting Bay. One town on the Kennebec holds statewide importance. Once home to the Abenaki people, it now boasts what some call the finest building in the state, the Capitol at Augusta. Designed by architect Charles Bulfinch and built from granite quarried nearby, Augusta has been the state capital since 1827. By the mid-19th century, Augusta was a thriving port town with river traffic running to and from Boston. But today, most travel to this capital city is by interstate. And the Kennebec River has been left to wend its way to the sea on its own. But where this river meets the sea, human industry returns in a big way. Bath Iron Works has supplied the U.S. Navy with some of the toughest ships in its long history. During World War II, 1 out of 4 American destroyers was Bath-built. At the height of the war effort, women went to work at the shipyard, and the Iron Works produced a new destroyer every 3 weeks. These days, it's a slower process. Here, the destroyer USS Wayne E. Meyer is preparing for launch, while a sister ship is taking shape. Ships from here have seen action off the coasts of France, the Philippines, and Vietnam. From the peaceful waters of Maine to any theater of war, crews came to respect and rely on Bath-built ships. While Bath's ships have gone to war, a few miles west, a famous writer was said to have started one. Here in Brunswick, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, the landmark book that attacked the cruelty of slavery. For 3 years, Stowe lived here in this Brunswick house. But it was earlier in Cincinnati that she met escaped slaves from the bordering state of Kentucky and learned of their appalling treatment. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852 and went on to become the best-selling novel of the 19th century and the second best-selling book following the Bible. It's claimed that when President Abraham Lincoln met Stowe during the Civil War, he said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Stowe's husband taught at nearby Bowdoin College, and it's campus lore that she often wrote in his study in Appleton Hall. The small but prestigious college dates from 1794, and its literary tradition had started as early as the 1820s, when writers Nathaniel Hawthorne and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow were classmates here. Longfellow, a true son of Maine, went on to become America's most loved 19th century poet. The lines, "Ships that pass in the night," and "Footprints on the sands of time" were originally Longfellow's, but are now so well known they are simply part of the American lexicon. Maine's wealth is not just its writers and poets, but also its wilderness. In the 17th century, it was England's demand for lumber that drove the settlement of Maine. Through the 18th century, lumber barons grew rich on the state's fabled forests of oak, pine, and spruce. And the city of Bangor, located on the Penobscot River, played a major role in the timber trade. At the entrance of Bangor stands evidence of just how serious this town is about its lumber. A 31-foot-tall statue of the mythical lumberjack, Paul Bunyan. Until the 1870s, Bangor was the lumber capital of the world, with 1 billion feet of timber shipped from its docks down the Penobscot River. By the 20th century, the lumber trade had moved west, and Bangor's glory days were over. Today, Bangor's economy is based on wholesale and retail trade. It's once again a thriving city and the commercial and cultural center of eastern Maine. The city is also home to one of the most prolific authors in the world, credited with almost as many movies as books. Once upon a time, not so long ago, a monster came to the small town of Castle Rock, Maine. So begins the thriller Cujo, penned by the Grand Master of the Macabre, Stephen King. Maine born and raised, King now makes his home in an old lumber baron's mansion. His best-selling horror stories, from Carrie to The Mist, often feature real Maine towns, and fictional ones like Castle Rock as a backdrop. In keeping with King's dark sense of humor, his home is protected by a gate adorned with bats and spiders. Just south of Bangor, it's the dizzying heights of Penobscot Narrows Bridge that can frighten visitors. It's the tallest public bridge observatory in the world and requires a ride in the fastest elevator in Maine to get there. From 420 feet in the air, the views of the Penobscot Narrows Bridge and the surrounding countryside are breathtaking. So too is the symmetry of one of the nation's best preserved forts, named after Henry Knox, America's first Secretary of War, and finished in 1844. It was the first fort in Maine to be built of granite. While this Fort Knox doesn't hold America's gold, it looks like it would be safe here. Maine's great forests part to reveal blueberry farms, lakes, and rivers that make this break in the trees seem very out of place. The desert of Maine. Its very strange story begins more than 10,000 years ago, when the glaciers of the last ice age ground soil and rocks into a layer of desert-like sand, some 80 feet deep. Over time, topsoil made a cap over the desert, hiding it until colonial farmers and sheep herders eroded the soil. And then the desert of Maine reappeared. At the south end of Casco Bay, the Maine coastline changes. Here, the sandy shoreline of the south breaks into a series of islands carved by melting glaciers thousands of years ago. The Calendar Islands. The islands we see today were once mountains until they were drowned by a sea of melting ice. While all the islands have felt nature's wrath, one tragic story of man's inhumanity began here on Harbor Island. In 1794, Benjamin Darling, a former slave from the West Indies, bought this island with the money he was given for saving his master's life in a shipwreck. He called it Horse Island. Over generations, his descendants settled on the nearby island of Malaga, where they intermarried with whites and eked out a living from the sea. After the Civil War, suspicion of the mixed-race community grew. Newspaper articles called it a blight on an otherwise picturesque isle. In 1912, in a sad chapter of the state's history, the government decided Malaga was an embarrassment. The state committed 8 people to the main school for the feeble-minded and evicted the rest. They even destroyed the island's cemetery. Some families moved their homes to the mainland. Others moved to nearby islands. A few may even have ended up back here on Harbor Island. With treacherous tides, hidden reefs, and shoals stretching 3,500 miles, it's no surprise that Maine's coastline has 60 lighthouses. Look in your pocket, and you may find this one on a coin. It's the Pemaquid Point Light, chosen by the state's residents to be featured on the Maine Quarter. In 1635, before the light was built, a man named John Bailey sailed for the New World, leaving his wife behind to follow him once he had established a home. But his ship, the Angel Gabriel, was smashed to pieces in a storm here. And although Bailey survived, his wife was afraid to follow him. They never saw each other again. Pemaquid Point Light was built on the mainland in 1827. From its ledge-top tower, the light shines 14 nautical miles out to sea, in the hope that no more ships will founder on the rocks below. One of the most idyllic railways in the country, the Maine Eastern, crosses the Sheepscot River to reach a perfectly preserved Maine village, Wiscasset. At the start of the 19th century, this was the busiest port in the state. Some say that there were so many ships anchored off Wiscasset, you could cross the harbor, stepping deck to deck. The town proudly calls itself Maine's prettiest village, and from the air, with its historic houses set off against a backdrop of colorful fall leaves, it's easy to see why. One of the great walks in Maine has to be along the granite breakwater of Rockland Harbor. Completed in 1899, the breakwater leads to a lighthouse on Penobscot Bay. Fishing vessels and ferries pass by the granite ledge all year long. And in July, the breakwater becomes the site of the annual Maine Windjammer Parade, featuring a display of turn-of-the-century cargo ships. On the west side of Penobscot Bay, the busy fishing port of Rockland is known to visitors as the place to catch ferries to the splendid islands of the bay. Southwest of Rockland, in the village of Cushing, is a site made famous by painter Andrew Wyeth. Here, a stark, weather-beaten farmhouse overlooks a river, and in the distance, the sea. In the 1940s, the Olson family, who owned the house, offered a young Andrew Wyeth a room as a part-time studio. Wyeth depicted the Olson house in his haunting painting, Christina's World. In the painting, a young girl, disabled with polio, crawls up the hill towards her house. It's one of the best-known works of American art, now exhibited in New York's MoMA. From the time he made his first drawings of Maine's islands at age 10 until his death in 2009, Wyeth captured a vision of rural Maine that is both beautiful and symbolic. Of the Olson house, Wyeth said, "I just couldn't stay away from there. It was Maine." Further up the coast to the north lies Rockport, an artist colony with one of the loveliest harbors in the state. Unspoiled by overdevelopment, its narrow harbor serves both the working lobster boats and classic wooden sailing ships. Rounding the peninsula north from Rockport, the town of Camden lies nestled amid gently sloping mountains at the edge of a sheltered harbor. The town that began as a fishing village is still a place where people make their living from the sea. Not from fishing, but from tourists eager to explore the ocean side. Today, the harbor buzzes with pleasure craft, and the homes of 19th century sea captains have become luxury hotels. It was in one of these hotels, the Whitehall Inn, that the young Edna St. Vincent Millay recited her award-winning poem, Renaissance. 11 years later, Millay became the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize for poetry. Today, 6,500 acres of the Camden Hills, which inspired Millay's poetry, are preserved as a state park. Renaissance describes both the landscape and a state of mind. All I could see from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood. I turned and looked another way and saw 3 islands in a bay. So with my eyes I traced the line of the horizon, thin and fine, straight around till I was come back to where I'd started from. And all I saw from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood. The poem, which became the title of Millay's first book, is still a favorite of those who choose to wander here, among the hills and woods of Maine. For those who'd rather climb than wander, Mount Batty offers stunning views of Camden and the islands of Penobscot Bay. Northeast of Camden is a small peninsula that holds Castine. Its tranquil image belies a colorful past. In the 17th century, it was fought over by the English, French, and Dutch. It takes its name from Baron de Saint Castin, a young Frenchman who married a native Penobscot princess and became an Abenaki chief. The British took Castine during the American Revolution, building Fort George as a defense against the colonial forces. Today, it's the site of a local ball field. In an ill-fated mission called the Penobscot Expedition, Americans tried but failed to retake Castine. After the British Navy set their ships ablaze, revolutionary troops were forced to flee overland back to Boston. It was the greatest American naval disaster until Pearl Harbor. The Down East Coast, as Mainers call everything east of Penobscot Bay, is simply a sailor's paradise. Sailing along the coast on a fair wind from Castine, vessels arrive at one of the greatest treasures of the United States, Acadia National Park. The park includes Mount Desert Island, the largest island in Maine. The name comes from French explorer Samuel de Champlain, who landed on the island in 1604. He wrote in his journal, "The mountain summits are all bare and rocky. I name it Island of Desert Mountains." Centuries later, Acadia became the summer home of the robber barons of the Gilded Age, the Rockefellers, Morgans, and Vanderbilts. They were drawn by the paintings of Thomas Cole and Frederick Church, who captured the island's awe-inspiring wilderness. J.P. Morgan moored his yacht in the harbor, and other wealthy residents entertained guests in lavish houses by the sea. But as more and more people inhabited the area, the wilderness started to disappear. Realizing that America's wild lands wouldn't last forever, a group of philanthropists stepped in. In 1901, the Rockefellers and others began buying huge tracts of forests for public use, and in 1919, they convinced Washington to declare the area the first national park east of the Mississippi. Today, Mount Desert Island's Bar Harbor is far less exclusive, but it remains a beautiful seaside town. High above the harbor stands Cadillac Mountain, climbing over 1,500 feet. This is the highest point along the North Atlantic coast and is said to be the first place in the United States to receive the sun's rays each day. But exploring Acadia National Park from the sea can be even more exciting. The Margaret Todd sails from Bar Harbor several times a day. She was built in 1998 in the style of a traditional cargo schooner. But these boats are now known locally as windjammers. Some say the name windjammers was the derogatory term used by early steamship sailors to describe the crews of old-fashioned wind-powered cargo ships. In 1935, artist Frank Swift began buying up these old masted vessels. He refit them for passengers and opened the first business of its kind. Thus began the first fleet of windjammers for sailing in America. Since then, thousands have enjoyed the thrill of sailing a tall ship out to sea. But Maine's visitors don't just come for its tall ships. The state is famous for its lobsters, and at one time they were so plentiful they were considered paupers' food. It's said that indentured servants in the 18th century lobbied to be fed lobster no more than twice a week. Maine's lobstermen still have to catch the creatures just as they have for 100 years, one trap at a time. But fishermen here don't just catch lobsters. On the far north coast, strange patterns can be seen floating on the water. They are a recent phenomenon and the focus of a bitter dispute between fishermen and environmentalists. At Cobscook Bay, young Atlantic salmon leap in their circular pens. Millions are raised in this bay alone to feed America's growing appetite for fish. Sadly, wild salmon are in drastic decline, and some of the blame is placed on the spread of diseases from farms like these. But these fishermen argue that they are just following in the path of generations of Mainers, harvesting the fruits of the sea. Despite its name, the West Quoddy Head Lighthouse stands at the easternmost tip of the United States. It is one of only 2 lights in the nation to have distinctive red and white stripes, a feature that was common to Canadian lighthouses, helping them stand out against the snow. At night, its light draws weary Mainers home from the sea to a state of stunning natural beauty. Aerial Maine is a journey across the state of poets, painters, and presidents. It's the down east state of windswept isles and great pine forests. The place where dawn first breaks on the nation, and harbor lights guide sailors after the sun sets. Finally, at journey's end, ships find welcome harbor on the mainland.